please mute yourself on entry so we don't have background noise. I also wanted to let you know that this session is being recorded, so just so you're aware. All right, well, good morning. I'm happy you are here today, and particularly pleased that you're interested in learning more about youth services librarianship, both as an academic degree program and as a career trajectory. I will provide a little bit of an overview, and then we should have plenty of time at the end of the session for Q&A. Please know that that's coming, and you can use the chat function to ask any questions, either as you think of them, or we will have a designated time at the end of the session. My name is Sarah Schwabel. I'm a professor of information sciences at this iSchool at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where I also direct the Center for Children's Books, which I'll be speaking about in the presentation today. I arrived at Illinois in 2019, right before the pandemic hit, and so have been thinking a lot about what we've learned about the field during COVID, and also the way that COVID and the pandemic experience continues to inspire change in the way that all of us do our work. So let's see. Okay, this is me. All right, I wanted to start today with this information from ALA, the American Library Association, because I think it captures so well the vision of youth services librarianship. I want to highlight a few things here. First is I'm struck when I look at the bullet point list of how much youth services librarianship has changed, even during the course of my lifetime. So sure, there are some things that remain constant: sharing books, cultivating a love of learning and reading, lifelong reading and literacy. Thinking about collection development and how to have books that speak to each reader on the shelf. But there are also a lot of things that have changed. Thinking here particularly of being an expert in technical electronic resources and teaching raising the comfort level of users around technology. Providing parenting education and family literacy programs. It's really fairly recently that the youngest humans have been welcome and celebrated within library spaces. And now children's rooms are buzzing with families bringing babies and toddlers into storytime hours. And I think in particular, that first bullet point, empowering and motivating young people as being the center of youth services librarianship. So really thinking about the librarian's central role, of course, encouraging reading, encouraging literacy, but really about helping individual young people be their best selves, and also use all of their talents and their creativity and their enthusiasm to actually be change agents in the world, so to improve society. So I, again, meet the 21st century librarian, a techno-literate, savvy professional. One way, an example, I think, of how youth services librarians really make a difference in the world is clear to me when we think about the way we've grappled with the pandemic. So libraries, as buildings that provide services, shut down along with schools and other institutions at the beginning of the pandemic. But what really became clear is that librarians are not defined by the space of the library, but rather by an approach to problem solving, connecting people to the information that they need and to information that nourishes. So what did libraries do when suddenly their doors were shuttered and their patrons were within the four walls of their individual homes? Many, many different things. I mean, the creativity of librarians nationwide nationwide is really astounding. But just to highlight a few, moving programming online quickly, pivoting, having, pulling out books, puppets, other props, and just making Story Hour a virtual experience to continue the dialogue between young people, their families, the libraries, and great literature. Pulling together bundles of books by interest, by age, by reading level that families could pick up curbside for every child under their roof. And not just books, but thinking about craft supplies. I know at the beginning of the pandemic, I was on a neighborhood listserv, and there were sort of desperate cries going out for supplies that had dwindled. Scotch tape was a big item of need, and so libraries actually stepped in to pull together supplies so children continued to create at home, create inspired by books, inspired by stories, inspired by their imagination. Of course, quickly pulling together resources to support and aid K-12 teachers who were suddenly teaching remotely and may not have had access to all of the print resources that they were accustomed to in their classroom or school libraries. Public librarians, school librarians really stepped in to fill the breach and quickly pull together materials that could help keep learning continuing apace during the pandemic. And of course, supporting youth reading. And I just, one statistic that I find really interesting comes out of the National Literacy Trust report from 2020 in the UK, where they were surveying young people ages 9 to 18. And they found that prior to the first COVID shutdown, 1 in 6 of their respondents had reported listening to an audiobook, so a fairly sizable number. But during the pandemic, 1 in 4 said that they listened to more audiobooks than they had previously. And I think the most important statistic for me is that 1 in 3 said that audiobooks made them feel better. So youth services librarians quickly tapped the digital resources in their collection, both ebooks and especially audiobooks, and continued providing essential, reader advisory services, even as libraries shut down. And also providing materials, reading lists and bibliographies that helped young people to understand their worlds, and current events. So in particular, I think bibliographies on anti-Black racism that could play important roles in helping young people become agents of change. So I want to turn now to talk a bit about the Center for Children's Books, which is located at the iSchool at the University of Urbana-Champaign, because I think it encapsulates the history of youth services librarianship, over the course of the 20th into the 21st century, and it provides a kind of case study of where the field is now in interesting ways. So the Center for Children's Books is actually just celebrating its 75th anniversary. Children's literature and youth services librarianship as a field really has its roots at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. And I'll say more about that in a bit. That's when the Newbery Medal was begun in 1922. But the field grew significantly during the post-war period, which of course isn't surprising. It grew in relation to response to the baby boom. Post-war baby boom. And this period of mid-century in the world of youth services librarianship and in children's publishing was really exhilarating. You had a tremendous expansion of the number of books being published. And these books were pouring into exhibition libraries. So sample copies from publishers. So that's what happened at the University of Chicago. Books hot off the presses for children and young people were pouring into the exhibition library that was a resource center for professors of education, primarily also for the community in Chicago. And the librarians there wanted to create a mechanism really to help separate the wheat from the chaff. So which books rose to the top, which books would really should be on library shelves, should be in every child's hands. And they were thinking about a few different elements, particularly the aesthetic quality, so both of the writing and illustrations, even the quality of the book themselves, really high valuing of the materiality of the book. But also with being attuned to children's needs. So really paying attention to child development and thinking about what books facilitated growth and learning, in particular gradations of age, so along a continuum of, say, birth to age 18. And additionally, in the post-war moment, thinking about ideals embedded in the book, and particularly ideals related to American democracy and citizenship. Thinking about building strong citizens in the wake of the post-war moment, and direct exposure to authoritarian and fascist governments. And in fact, the center was tapped by the U.S. Commission of Education at the end of the war to assemble a bibliography of books that they would recommend to be sent to occupied Japan. So that really sort of encapsulates sort of ideas that were behind the center of book evaluation. And evaluating books and other media is a central component of youth services librarianship, and has been from the beginning. And the Center for Children's Books became one of the key centers where this important work happened. And it has a history of having really dynamic, influential, brilliant editors who, through their work in evaluating children's literature and media, greatly shaped the field. So Zena Sutherland served as the editor of the Bulletin and at the Center for Children's Books for decades, from 1958 to 1985. And you can think about all of the books published in the era, in major classics that I'm sure were you were encountered either in school or your public library. Books like Charlotte's Web, the most widely taught work of children's literature, Little Bear, even The Cat in the Hat, about which we've heard a lot lately, and speaks to some of the issues of mid-century children's literature. We'll talk about that more in a bit. So Zena Sutherland promoted, encouraged really innovative, exciting, dynamic authors. Judy Blume, Marie Sendak, Eric Carle, Louise Fitzhugh, names you're likely quite familiar with. And she was a dynamo. She single-handedly wrote all the reviews for the Bulletin. So you think about thousands of books pouring in. She had command of knowledge of all of the books pouring in from publishers each year, numbers that were increasing in this post-war moment. And then she personally read and reviewed up to 20 books a week. So you can think about the breadth and depth of knowledge that occurs when you're surrounded by all of the books being produced in any particular year. And so when she retired, the next editor for the Bulletin, Betsy Hearn, who also served as editor for decades, continued many of the traditions of Bulletin reviewing, but also shifted things so that there is a team of reviewers sitting around the table reviewing books. And this is a practice that continues today, although during the pandemic, those meetings have temporarily moved to virtual spaces. But what this allows is, well, first of all, the basement of iSchool is flooded with books, boxes and boxes and boxes of books coming hot off the press from publishers. So basically all the new books, all the new picture books, all the new board books, all the new trade books coming in. And those who work in the space have a real sense of everything that's being published. So when you're reviewing a particular title, you're doing so in conversation with, in connection to knowledge about everything that's being produced. And of course, when you do this work for a decade or more, you're comparing any particular title to all of the books that are surrounding it, and also to all of the books of its ilk that have been published previously. So the amount of knowledge of contemporary literature is quite astounding. And this is important because it informs reviews, and those reviews in turn then inform help to shape book selection policies, acquisition by public and school libraries. So ultimately can influence the kind of books that land on the shelves. In addition, this book reviewing, this book evaluation process is unfolding within the context of the School of Information Science, where scholars, faculty are engaged in a range of work, of research around children's books, children's media, youth literacy, youth technology. And so there's sort of a dynamic where recent scholarship, the conversations, trends in the field and scholarship are become entwined, and shape, inform the book reviewing practice. And this is something that's unique to publication of the bulletin. And again, is something that it's a 75-year-old tradition now. And we are currently, so more about that shaping of the scholarship. So the Center for Children's Books hosts the bulletin and has for 75 years. And beginning in 2022, it will host another journal, a relatively new young journal founded in 2016, research on diversity and youth literature. And this journal is open access and online. And it was collaboratively founded by a group of activist scholars. I'm going to quote here from their literature, who embody, research, and foreground diversities, inclusivity, advocacy, and visibility for scholarship that is not always privileged or acknowledged within academia. The mission of research on diversity and youth literature is to publish scholarship attending to issues of diversity, equity, social justice, inclusion, and intersectionality in youth literature, culture, and media. So this is very exciting, cutting edge journal that is seeking to publish the kind of work that traditionally has had more difficulty gaining traction and well-established and more mainstream journals of children's literature and youth services librarianship. So clearly cutting edge. And what's particularly exciting about that is, as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Center for Children's Books, we are really thinking about how we want to continue to grow and evolve and solidify a tradition of book and media evaluation. And of course, issues of thinking about diversity, inclusion, and equity are at the center of that work. So the advantage of a kind of in-house book reviewing operation is twofold. One, you have a group of people who can sit around a table and discuss in great depth the literature that's coming in relation to all the other books produced this year and in previous years. And as I said, you have the benefit of being in close connection, literally rubbing shoulders with people who are writing research, scholarship related to books and the field. But the challenge, the flip side of that is you are also limited by the people in the room as opposed to having reviewers from afar. So we are in the process of thinking about that. How do we expand? How do we retain those important elements that have led to reviews, sharp, progressive reviews, but also increase the number of increase diverse perspectives, increase expertise that exists outside the room, outside the space, and an exciting element of bringing in another journal that's doing that scholarship directly is to think about how that scholarship that is coming out of a research journal can continue to shape, influence the book reviewing practices long a part of children's youth services librarianship. So in sum, youth service librarianship has changed, is changing, and in doing so really aims to change the world, because reviews shape which books get onto library shelves. And even beyond that, reviews, the history of reviews actually shapes which books get published in the first place, what publishers are looking for. So one way, as I said, issues of diversity, equity, social justice, and inclusion are at the forefront. They're at the absolute center of questions asked in youth services librarianship today. And scholars, book reviewers, practicing librarians who are doing reader advisory are all asking questions about these issues and about how to redress absences, omissions, distorted representations, and how to increase the number and diversity of books that will nurture the current generation of children. So one way we can examine those issues is by looking at the history of youth services librarianship. So really probing into the past and thinking about the future. And I would argue that as a field, children's literature, youth services librarianship is really just starting to grapple with its own history. And I think that's exciting because it's a time when those in the field can be part of the dismantling, the rebuilding, and the reaffirming of commitments. And so one way into this is to think about the most influential prize in the field of children's literature. And it's a prize that is given by a committee of ALA, ALSC, children's and youth services librarians who are deciding which book is going to receive a shiny medal at the end of the year. So you're undoubtedly familiar with the Newbery because these are the books that have that gold shiny medal and are often segregated on library shelves. They have their own shelf space of Newbery medal books, both in bookstores and libraries and school classrooms. Oftentimes, these are books that are widely taught because there's a way in which the medal offers a kind of stamp of approval that has, at least in the past, made the book appear really kind of beyond reproach. And you may have also encountered mock Newbery celebrations in which people gather in schools or gather in public libraries to engage in the process of selecting which book they believe if they were serving on the Newbery selection committee, should receive that recognition as the most distinguished book of children's literature for the year. The challenge is that, in the past, the Newbery has been seen as a kind of untouchable canon. And so Newbery medal books have remained in circulation kind of in perpetuity. Only one is sort of decidedly out of print at the 100th anniversary. They've also remained on reading lists and often as part of classroom assignments. But of course, the children's books that won the medal in a particular year reflect the historical moment in which they were prized and the author's experiences of writing, living, breathing in a particular moment. The Newbery selection, being a member of the Newbery selection committee, has long been coveted, seen as almost the pinnacle of one's service as a youth services librarian. And of course, the profession itself has from its inception been fairly narrow in membership. So youth services librarianships has been dominated by white women, and so the and also, at least in the earliest years, women who shared many attributes. So educated at the same group of schools, coming from families that held similar values, having shared similar life experiences. And so, a lot of agreement about what constitutes a distinguished, and about placing aesthetics as the most important element of criteria in evaluating literature. So, two projects at this 100th anniversary juncture to think about examining past practices as a way of educating, informing, and thinking about shaping future practice. So with my colleague Jocelyn Van Tile, I just published a collection of essays, Dust Off the Gold Medal, Rediscovering Children's Literature at the Newbery Centennial, that takes a decade by decade approach, looking at books that won the Newbery and really trying to get at, why did a particular title win the Newbery at that particular moment in time? What can it tell us about the concerns, the values of the librarians who are prizing and publishers who are publishing at that particular moment? And what do close readings of this book, this prize-winning book, from the vantage point of 2021 reveal? In what ways are there, colonialist, racist framings that should make us hesitate as we create bibliographies, as we shelve books? What kind of contextualization is necessary as we circulate titles? And we are on November 5th, the Center for Children's Books and ALSC, the Association of Library Services to Children, will be hosting a symposium to really look deeply at the Newbery at this moment of its 100th anniversary. So we've gathered together a group of really dynamic the archivists for ALA Archives, scholars from Library and Information Science, from English and African American Studies, from education, to talk about the Newbery Medal at this juncture. And we've also gathered together a group of alums who've served on the Newbery Medal committee. So graduates of the Master's in Library and Information Science program at Illinois and at peer institutions are often represented on the Newbery Selection Committee. And so it's a chance for them to also talk about what service on that committee needs and the change that the committee itself has seen over the course of the last, say, half century. So we have panelists who served on committees from the 70s all the way up to chairing the committee this year. So I expect that will be a really dynamic conversation about the ways in which the profession is examining past practices and thinking about the best ways forward at this juncture. We can ask a lot of questions, right? What do we learn by examining the past history of librarianship? What do we learn about children's culture, for example, as a means of sustaining and replicating racism? And how should current practices shift in scholarship, in collection development, and deliberating future prize winners? And even a question of, is the idea of prizing a single title in a given year itself inherently problematic? So lots of food for thought as we think about this 100th anniversary marker. That said, I think the Newbery is interesting in other ways because it encapsulates, in many ways, it showcases the success and the influence and the power of youth services librarianship as a field. So the Newbery Medal was was begun as a means to stimulate production of high quality children's books in the United States, to attract authors to write books for children, right? So, writing children's literature at the time was seen as lower prestige. Still an issue today, although because YA fiction in particular is so marketable, now some authors clamor to get that label. So that provides a stark contrast to the early part of the 20th century. But you can just look at numbers. So when the Newbery Medal originated in the 1920s, there were 450 titles that could have been considered for the award. That's how many new books published in the United States were there. Now that number is more like there's some 32,000 youth titles published in any given year. And to a large degree, that success can be traced to all of the advocacy, all the support of librarians who demanded high quality literature, stories that would nurture youth. So we've talked a little bit about the whiteness of the Newbery canon. There are other absences when we think about the Newbery, and this is another issue that is of high importance to scholars in the field, and that is, where are the children? Where are the young people? So if you think about the Newbery Medal, it's a book for young people, but it is also an award that is a coveted award that is given by adults. So the author of the book is an adult, the publisher of the book is the adult, and the people gathered in the room to officially to make the official decision about who should receive the Newbery, all adults. In contrast, say, to mock Newbery events that often take place in school classrooms or public libraries or entire schools, where children are gathered and have animated debate about which book is the best, and their choices often deviate from the choices made by adults. So one longtime criticism of the Newbery, there have been many, many, many criticisms of the Newbery, but one recurring criticism of the Newbery over decades is that Newbery Medal books are boring, or they're the books that one is assigned versus books that are chosen. It's not universally true. There are plenty of favorite popular Newbery books, but it's a recurring critique. So, how do we use the centennial as an opportunity to examine the past and to rethink? So one way we're doing it, youth services faculty at the Center for Children's Books are doing it, is by, again, collaborating with ALSC to make a call to collect children's voices at this juncture. So I'm going to turn on a video and then I'll be back.
So Sarah, I don't think there's audio being projected.
So I'm hearing that maybe you can't hear the audio. Let me try another way. Sorry about that.
I could go ahead and share. I have it loaded.
Oh, perfect.
Yep.
Sorry, everyone, it worked in a test run.
It's okay. Is that working? Can you hear the audio?
Yeah,
it's
better. These are Newbery Medal winners, which is an award for children's literature.
Do you see any of your favorites? Tell us why you like them.
What did you love about reading a Newbery book?
Do you avoid Newberries like their smelly socks? Why?
Do you have a favorite Newbery character? Who?
Can you describe how you felt when you learned about a Newbery Award winner?
Have you even heard of the Newbery Medal? Got no idea?
If you could give a book a gold medal, which would you pick and why?
The Newbery Award is celebrating its 100th anniversary.
Adults decide which books win the Newbery. Now it's your turn. We want to hear from you.
We invite your artwork, stories, and video, and poetry, and more.
Inspired by books you love and the ones you don't.
For more information and to share your thoughts, visit www.mynewbery100.web.illinois.edu.
For sharing voices. Okay. All right. So we invite you, if you have young people in your lives, encourage them to submit to the archive. But basically, the idea is we have a collection of papers. ALA has archives on the Newbery Medal. So everything from which books were being considered in a particular year to correspondence asking again and again, this happened multiple times, do we really have to give an award this year? It doesn't seem like good books, but there doesn't seem like there's one that stands out. There's really no distinguished book, right? So a lot of conversation, reflection by adults as they're working towards making a decision, vote tallies in some cases of which books received what number of votes by the people sitting on the committee. A lot of adult ideas, a lot of adult thoughts, but again, missing children. And so we value, nothing is valued more by youth services librarians than the ideas, the thoughts, the opinions of young people themselves. And so at this juncture of the 100th anniversary, we want to try to correct the archival record by starting to pull together the ideas and thoughts, document them both for our understanding of youth today, but also thinking ahead to 50, 100 years hence, the ability to understand life, thinking about books, about literacy, about important issues in the world is incomplete if we don't have a record of children, of young people. And so we are working to expand the archive by including youth voices, and of course by ensuring that the youth voices represented in our collection process also represent the full range of American childhoods. So we are working to think about how we can invite, encourage young people to share their ideas with us. This is going to be 2 parts. Locally, we have already run events at the Community Fab Lab, which is a makerspace that invited local children to read books, Newbery books of their choice, and then make in response to that reading experience. And then we'll be doing outreach via Zoom to invite public and school librarians to collaborate with us nationwide and bringing children to this project. After we gather the data and then we'll think about the kinds of research questions we can ask both now and later about with what we have. And importantly, we want to involve youth themselves in framing those questions. So while the youth services faculty who collaborate on this project, bringing their various expertise in makerspace, in youth as collaborators, and a history of childhood, and archives, and storytelling, so many different disciplinary approaches to bear in thinking about this project, we want to invite young people themselves to think about what questions we want to ask about the information we've gathered. What can we learn about the Newberry at this juncture from young people themselves? I want to share one more project that sort of that's coming out of the Center for Children's Books and provides a window into the kinds of work, the kinds of questions being asked by those studying youth services librarianship. So I've been involved for I guess about a decade now on a Books to Parks project. So this is an initiative begun by the National Park Service to think about pairing award-winning works of children's literature, so including Newbery Medal books, that have ties to lands protected by the federal government, and to think about how books can connect people to those places. So in my work in the project, a central question I have in thinking about connecting children's literature, award-winning children's literature, to national parks and to national historic monuments as well, is how can youth literature help to catalyze conversations about racism and colonialism? So national, of course, there's a recent article by David Truer in the Atlantic about a proposal that national parks should be restored to Indigenous peoples. So if we start from you start with the premise that the land itself on which national parks sit is stolen native lands, and so that's a starting place, and then think about the ways books set in these places or tied to these places, if we probe them, if we look at omissions, silences, and distortions, can help us learn and intercede. So the first project, the first Books to Parks project, centered on the novel Island of the Blue Dolphins, which won the Newbery Medal in 1961. It's the story of an Indigenous woman on San Nicolas Island, which is the most remote of California's Channel Islands, and her natal home was impacted by the international fur trade first. So the search for lucrative sea otters, but also intersects with imperialism, because Indigenous people, the Aleuts from Alaska, were brought down really as conscripted labor by the Russian Empire to hunt for sea otter in and around the island where this Indigenous woman lived. There was a battle, the population was decimated by a combination of that battle and exposure to diseases. And then after that fact, when the population dwindled, then you have Indian removal with the native peoples of the California Channel Islands being brought to the mainland, still during the primarily during the era which to missions, when the mission system was still unfolding or beginning to be dismantled. And so you have the intersection of this story with imperialism and with settler colonialism. You also have a narrative that is fundamentally a vanishing Indian story. So it's based on an actual Indigenous person. So the Books to Parks project provides chapter by chapter summaries of the novel, and then asks questions, fact checks. Is this true? Is that true? And connects directly to primary and secondary sources, and does so in a way that facilitates conversation about settler colonialism. So widely taught novel. It's a novel that has been widely taught for decades. It has risen to the level of a children's classic, and it's unlikely to go anywhere soon. But we can surround the text, we can use the text in ways that help move forward important conversations, important learning. So that project is launched. That's the URL there if you want to check it out. It also has a digital archive that collects hundreds of 19th century news accounts about the historical story of this Indigenous woman who lived alone on the island for 18 years and becomes the model for the protagonist, Karana. In fact, many of the mythic tropes, including that of sort of the vanishing Indian, the last surviving person of her race, quote unquote, that's embedded in the story's framework, actually stems from these news accounts that were circulating rapidly, really went viral in the United States and beyond in the 19th century. Current project, which is being built by graduate students and undergraduates at the Center for Children's Books, centers on Christopher Paul Curtis's novel, The Watsons Go to Birmingham, 1963. And it's being built in collaboration with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute and the Civil Rights National Monument in Birmingham. And here the questions are different, somewhat different. So Scott O'Dell, white author in the 60s, writing an outsider, this story, assuming the voice of this Indigenous woman. Christopher Paul Curtis, African-American author, novel set in drawing on his own childhood, to a degree, his own childhood experiences in Flint, Michigan, where the first two-thirds of the novel is set. But there are also ways in which the novel is infused with his own nostalgia of a certain stage of his youth. And so you get a novel that unfolds and depicts Birmingham as a place, a warm, relatively safe place for a child. The characters live in a African-American community. They attend a largely segregated school with inspiring Black teachers where they read Langston Hughes in class. And then during the last third of the novel, they make an interstate drive that brings them progressively south to Birmingham, Alabama. And their timing of their arrival coincides with the Birmingham campaign and the backlash against the push for civil rights and the Children's Crusade in the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church, which leads to the death of 4 girls attending Sunday school, and the characters in the book witness that text. So some of the questions that we're asking in connection to this Books That Park site is, again, where are the omissions and the silences? We are all very aware of the Flint lead water crisis, right? And also you may be familiar with, Birmingham is booming, and it's a really, it's a place that many, they've had reverse migration with many African-American families choosing to live and make their homes in Birmingham because of all that the city has to offer. So how did we get here, right? If this is 1960 and here's 2021, how did we get here? So in other words, where is the structural racism in Flint? It's not necessarily, it's hard to see in the narrative itself. So one of the things we're doing and surrounding this book with rich contextualizing material is helping to trace a longer story that includes civil rights activity in the North as well as the South, and also the ways that structural racism affected people in the Rust Belt in addition to the Deep South at this period. So just very briefly, here are some of the fabulous faculty members I am working with on these projects. You can see a wide array of expertise from education, literacy, British literature, to the maker movement, digital youth, African-American literature, storytelling, comics. And there are a range of courses offered both at Illinois and also peer schools, peer I schools that cover the full gamut. Youth services librarianship is very broad, both in terms of disciplinary approaches taken to asking important questions to the field, topics explored, expertise developed, and the courses offered really reflect that range. I want to make sure that I leave time for questions, so I'm going to pause now and welcome your questions. Is there anything you'd like me to speak about further? Questions about where people take the degree? Yes, thank you, Anthony. So the question was other ways to get involved and get experience in evaluating media and literature for youth. Absolutely. I mean, I can speak specifically about Illinois. So there are always graduate students, reviewers at the Bulletin. And there are opportunities. So there's both sort of on the ground training, if you will, by sitting in on weekly Bulletin meetings where you hear people evaluate books. So literally sitting around the table and learning by being immersed in that environment. And there's also formal coursework. So you can also take a class specifically on reviewing books, where you gain specific professional skills in evaluating literature, writing a review of appropriate length and scope, et cetera, with reference to other texts, with awareness of current scholarship, and then getting feedback and revising. It's also, I would say, just integrated into other kinds of coursework where it might be where we're constantly talking about books, and we're talking about books and media in the context of a larger history of the field. So even in courses not specifically directed towards the end product of reviewing, you would be in the process of gaining skills. And I would say graduates from the program go on to have many write reviews for the full range of the big 5 review journals, and a number have moved into leadership positions, including editing positions in journals as well. So yes, absolutely. Sorry, I see another question. I'm just gonna read, let's see. Someone who is in the process of applying. What do you see as the most forward-looking specialty and youth services to meet the needs of kids over the next 10 years? That's a great question. And I think partly we can't predict the future. And so, I think that all skills, you're going to be gaining skills and also gaining skills to gain new skills, right? So partly it's about the process of learning that takes place in a graduate program. I think that positions you to constantly be learning, know how to tackle new topics, anticipate questions that need to be asked, that need to be answered, and even knowing your way around the literature and around the field that you get a real sense for by being immersed in a program. So I don't think that there's anything specific. I couldn't put my finger on something specific. I think it's the collection of knowledge and skills that actually propel you to be able to continue to learn as you move forward. And I can just, speaking from my own experience, that's certainly the case for me and my own graduate study, is that the most valuable, you have a bedrock from which to go, but the most valuable thing is becoming your own best teacher, which also means knowing where to look when you need to learn something new. Okay, great question. So Monica's asked, what suggestions you have for keeping children's collections up to date with a taste of current youth? And of course, adult nostalgia is real, and we all have favorite books from our own childhood. But how do you get a sense of what appeals to kids now? How do you keep up with current tastes? I think, in part reading voraciously. Of course, you can't read any book. I mean, those numbers are astounding, right? Can you imagine a day when there are only 450 books for youth coming out in a year, right? You can't possibly read when you're up to the 30,000 and more, right? It's impossible. But I do think reviews are a great place to start, and they can be both formal reviews in published journals, but also just blogs. And of course, there's nothing beats speaking to youth themselves. So I think being on the ground, talking to children about books, but talking to children about their lives, hearing their ideas, hearing their thoughts. I mean, that's the way that you keep current, is staying immersed to the degree you can as an adult outsider and in youth culture itself. Oh, okay, great. So what type of work does the CCB or iSchool do with other forms of children's media? So there's we're actually in the process of developing, there's a lot of work on gaming. And new and Moises or Emma, maybe you can jump in. Is it news? I don't think it's a certificate, a new specialty in gaming and game studies as an option. Certainly comics, graphic novels. Professor Cara Tilly, that's one of her specialties, and she regularly offers courses on it. Yes, for gaming.
That is correct. But yeah, game studies. But I believe that pathway or certificate is only available for undergrads. But I could double check. Okay,
thank you. But certainly the courses are on
right.
offer,
Yeah,
and the expertise is there.
Most definitely.
Yes, so gaming, comics, a big focus. Don't know that anyone's working on plays specifically, but there's a lot of interest among faculty among audiobooks. We brought in a guest speaker, in fact, to our speaker series last year, specifically on audiobooks, which is booming. And the pandemic certainly gave it another lift. And thinking about all of the ways that young people engage with story today. Certainly books is one piece of a much larger puzzle. Oh my goodness, some of my favorite recent children's books. While I'm talking about audiobooks, the one that has really captured me of late is Roller Girl, which is it's mind-boggling because it's a graphic novel written illustrated by a graduate of Rhode Island School of Art and Design, so someone who really is a graphic artist, right? And it was made into an audiobook, which has also received rave reviews. So I've been thinking a lot about just the different forms that story takes. And here's a story that is phenomenal as a graphic novel, and also as an audiobook. So yeah, that's a book that has wowed me of late. There's so many. I think we have about another minute if there are any more questions. Okay, so let me just ask, so Anthony has asked, is there a way for academic librarians to be involved in this sort of work? By this sort of work, do you mean like book evaluation and book reviewing, or something else? I'll speak to please just let me know in the chat, but to start with book reviewing, absolutely. I mean, I think graduates of the program have gone on to be curators of children's literature collections. So certainly that's another pathway, right? In developing an expertise in collections combined with sort of thinking about archives. They may be focused on historical or more contemporary. Certainly both kinds of collections exist. And yes, academic librarians, I mean, the bulletin positions for reviewing for the bulletin, for example, are open to all. There's no restriction on a kind of librarian one needs to be. And I think academic librarians bring their own expertise. So that's certainly not a barrier. Yes. Okay. And you said, yeah, yes. Well, I think I mean, it depends what kind of academic librarian, maybe. I mean, because certainly there are academic librarians that support children's literature collections. Like at Illinois, it's called SHELL, which is an acronym that it's connected to school, its roots, an original name connected to schools. So school collections. So these librarians do a lot of work with teacher candidates. So both undergraduate and graduate students who are training to become primary and secondary teachers, they need to stay current on children's literature. And so academic librarians who support that student body, of course, need themselves to be very familiar and current and both historical and current children's literature. So I think that's a way that the field's academic librarianship can very much intersect with youth services librarianship. And I think, it's interesting, this language, right? In that world, children's literature is maybe a more common term. I'm sort of using them interchangeably, or YA literature, but it's all the same. Youth services librarianship work with youth material. Children's literature scholars work with youth material. It's just different terms sort of have been used more in different disciplinary fields. And it's a field that is itself, major practitioners coming out of schools of education, colleges of arts and sciences, literature programs, comp lit programs, my own degrees in history, and then also schools of library and information science. So all three schools coming together. And I see a few more questions. Let me just catch up here. Oh, just comments. Okay, great. Well, I think we are at time. I'll put my email in the chat, and I'm very happy to field questions, additional questions, if anyone has them.
Yes, I added, Sarah, your profile to the chat as well, so that people can read a little bit more about your history and things that you have published, and then what you're teaching. It also contains your email, which is easy in case they can't grab it from the chat box. I also included the link to the INFOcon session. So today is the last day, which we're really sad about, but it's been a wonderful event. So thank you so much for attending so many different sessions. Hopefully there's something else this afternoon that interests you that you can also join. UIUC's last faculty member, Kathy Blake, will be presenting this afternoon at 4:15 on health informatics. So we would love to see you there if you're interested in health informatics. But thank you so much again for joining today's session. Sarah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was fascinating to me, and I'm really excited to incorporate some of the things that I learned about the Newbery Medal and just youth literature in general to my conversations with prospective students. So we hope that everybody enjoyed this, and we appreciate you being here with us. Thank you again for joining. Stay safe and have a good rest of your day.